I'm going to turn over the stage to the members of our plenary on home ownership, which are going to be led by Bob Pullman from CNHED. The plenary will also feature Ed Krause from the Greater Capital Association of Realtors, George Rothman from Manna Incorporated, Brad Fennell from William C. Smith and Company, and Peter Tatian from the Urban Institute.
Thank you, Emily. Peter will be joining us momentarily. Good afternoon. For the next 45 minutes, we'll be discussing whether home ownership is still a good investment for low and moderate income district residents. Is it still a good asset building vehicle? Our distinguished panel of experts has already been introduced, so I won't repeat that. But rather than ask each panelist to make a presentation, the way we're going to handle this is more as a roundtable discussion. And we'll reserve the last 15 minutes of our 45 minutes so that you can interact with the panel, ask questions, and make comments. The home ownership rate in the United States is the lowest it's been in more than a decade, and hampered by a rise in foreclosures and weak demand for housing. The District of Columbia has an unemployment rate of 9.5%, with unemployment in Ward 8 above 25%. At the same time, FHA 30-year fixed mortgages are possible to get for an interest rate of under 4.5%. And there are opportunities to purchase through short sales and foreclosures at prices we haven't seen in a long time. So what does this all mean? Is this a good time for home ownership, or isn't it? In beginning to discuss that, I think I'll start with Peter, who is at the Urban Institute and has done a lot of research in various areas, foreclosures and housing prices and so forth. And maybe, Peter, you can start setting the stage, and then we'll move on to other participants here as to where we're at today and you know, in this climate.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Bob said, we at the Urban Institute and as part of our Neighborhood Info DC project spend a lot of time looking at data about the District of Columbia, and I know that many of you have been to some of our past sessions talking about the housing market in particular. We've been tracking what's been going on with housing prices and with foreclosures in the city. So just recently was looking at some of the latest home sales figures for the city, and we have seen recently a drop in home prices in D.C. So home prices are now about where they were in early 2005. Currently in the city. So there was actually about a 26% drop in the median price of a single-family home in D.C. Over the past year, between the second quarter of 2009 and 2010, and that's in constant dollars. So that's a pretty significant drop in prices. So the median went from about $593,000 to about $440,000 over that period. And it was similar across a lot of the city, except in wards 1, 3, and 6, where prices in those three wards pretty much stayed relatively stable over that last year. But prices in wards 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8 all had that similar 25% drop. So there's two ways, of course, to look at that. I mean, one is, of course, for people who own homes now, and for the city that depends on property tax revenue, this drop in home values is not something that they necessarily appreciate. But on the other hand, it creates an opportunity in terms of affordability that now that house prices have come down a bit, maybe there's some opportunity to get some more folks into home ownership who might not have been able to afford things previously. So to give you just an example, in Ward 5, the median price of a home has gone from $364,000 a year ago to about $321,000, and that means the income you need to buy that house has gone from about $64,000 a year to $57,000 per year. So that's still pretty high for a lot of people. So it's not that those prices are making everything very affordable for everyone, but it has, I think, eased things a little bit.
Great. For the others on the panel, I'd like to know what your experience has been over the past couple of years in how the market's changed for low and moderate income home ownership, and in terms of who's looking to buy, who's actually able to purchase the properties, what kind of financing are they getting, just to set the stage for talking about home ownership as an investment vehicle. So, Brad, you want to comment on that?
Sure. Well, by way of background, William C. Smith and Company is active currently in the for-sale market over in Ward 8. We have a history of providing for-sale opportunities east of the river. And so my comments really are limited to that portfolio. And currently, we're developing Ashford Court, which is the lower half of the Camp Sims redevelopment along Mississippi Avenue. And those prices really, the product is really more moderate to market, even for that neighborhood. And so we delivered the first 20 homes in the first quarter of '08. And what we saw, we had 19 of the 20 homes sold. We kept one for a model. And 10 of those 19 made it to settlement. But 9, the ones that had a little bit sketchy or riskier profiles, weren't able to close in the beginning of '08. And so we've had to carry that portfolio for quite some time. '09 was a disastrous year. There was no movement whatsoever because I think in large part people didn't know, they were sounding, they didn't know where the bottom was, and so nothing was transacting. But by the beginning of this year, we made a concerted effort to go back out. It's interesting, the 25% drop is actually indicative of exactly where we were in terms of readjusting our prices, and we've sold 8 of the 10 year to date. And in terms of the typical buyer, there really is no certain profile. We've had retirees, we've had military transfer, we've had a young couple who was engaged and excited about their wedding coming together. We've had people by and large with enough income to be able to, and enough credit to be able to qualify for FHA or VA mortgages, and I think that's been what we've seen.
Well, obviously that young couple did not have a destination wedding, I take it.
Correct.
George, what about from Manna's perspective? You're involved in affordable home ownership. And Brad, by the way, were any of these folks, are they in the category of being assisted at all with HPAP?
There was one that had some HPAP in it.
Mm-hmm. So this is low, moderate income, or moderate income.
It's more
probably.
moderate.
It's moderate income, trying to buy on their own.
That's correct.
Okay. George, you want to comment on that?
Well, I've been through several recessions, both on the receiving and the giving end. And receiving end, I've been laid off a few times. That dates me, I know. And unfortunately, this time and other times I've had to lay off people. So it's very devastating. I think what's been different this time, Bob, is that I felt going into the recession that Manna was going to do fairly well because we serve first-time home buyers. There may be low income, but they're first-time home buyers. They don't have to worry about trading up. There was good financing for them, but the opposite happened. And basically, we think the opposite happened because people got scared over time, and it was so prolonged. In the past, it hasn't lasted as long as it has this time. And so the fear came out. Fear really entered into it a lot. And generally, the people we work with, are scared anyway because they come from backgrounds where no relative has ever owned property, and they themselves have always been renters. But the exaggeration this time with the impact has been substantial. What we've seen in the past year, well, a few things we've noted, that people who get financial education and who get 30-year fixed rate mortgages survive well. And this is, I don't know about if there's a lot of data on this, but anecdotally I've talked to nonprofit leaders all over the country, and they have the same experience we do. Those people haven't been hurt. The ones that were hurt who took the ones who got the chancy mortgages. So, and then I think in the past 6 months we've seen a small change of attitude. People feel a little more positive, but then the flip side is the lender requirements are much greater. The process is longer. It's more frustrating for the people, and their documents get lost. They have to supply them again and again, And so I think we're a little better off now, and we're on a slightly upward trend.
So, George, the homebuyer education that's done, does that begin to address the fears and apprehensions that low and moderate income buyers have?
Well, it does, but the economy has been so severely negatively impacted that just education can't overcome that.
Right. Ed, you want to comment on your perspective, general perspective?
Sure. Actually, I think we're settling in to the new reality. I think in the last 2 years, late 2008, 2009, you had a lot of, I think on the first, and from most of my experiences from my members and their experiences, is a lot of pent up low-income buyers who were who recognized that the market was maybe too much for them and sort of saved their pennies, hoarded some dollars, and were waiting for the fall in housing prices. So there was some segment of sort of pent up sort of assets that people were waiting. They knew they couldn't play in the sort of mid-2000s market, and then when things turned in 2008, 2009, they started to say, okay, maybe we can jump in with in the addition to the $8,000 tax buyer's credit. That helped push a lot of those folks over the edge. So they had they had the support of having some liquidity and some down payment money saved up and ready for when this time came, and then they got the added bonus of the $8,000 tax credit. So I think what you're starting to see now is the reality of, I don't want to say, hopefully it's not too long of a foreseeable future, but sort of where we're at in the marketplace. Like, this is sort of where we're at now, and we're going to have to sort of get used to that new reality. So I think it forestalled just a little bit.
George, comment?
Yeah, I would just add to that is that I think I obviously don't think this recession is good, but I think some good will come out of it. And that's the fact that people will, hopefully, the focus will now be on more the traditional values that people used to think that home ownership gave them, and not just as a vehicle to making fast profit or building equity excessively quickly.
I'm glad you said that, George, because that, the market almost had gotten distorted by that. Housing is a great investment. Forget about everything else. And I think that's really important for low and moderate income people. There's been a lot of talk about what has caused the problem with foreclosures, and a lot of the heat has, first of all, some of it's gone to banks on Community Reinvestment Act requirements. Some people have said, well, that's what caused all of this. But what that really is code words for is that it's those low-income people that have been irresponsible. In fact, I just heard this last week as a major cause of the problem. And I know there have been abusive loans and so on and so forth. But what's your perspective on that? Any of you could comment. What has caused the problem, and why, since there's been a problem, does it pertain to low-income folks that have suffered the most, that have been involved in most of the abusive loans? And if that's the case, then what's the environment now? And is it good for low and moderate income people to try to become homeowners? Anybody?
No. Oh, go ahead, Peter. No.
Well, I think so Bob, the CRA story is one that's is a real struggle for us, because it's been so strongly put out there that this idea of trying to promote responsible lending on the part of banks was somehow responsible for this crisis, when that was clearly not the case. And there's been more research now that has been trying to, refute some of these claims, which, by the way, there's absolutely no evidence for any of them that CRA was responsible for this. So we're kind of having to respond to some arguments that don't even really have any basis. But Harvard, for example, just recently came out with some research looking at the fact that very few of the troubled loans were really made by CRA-eligible institutions, and that the performance of loans by CRA institutions has been relatively good compared to the market overall. So I think that we need to steer things away from that conversation and more towards the irresponsibility of the lending that actually did go on by a variety of different institutions, and the sort of a mad rush for profit that fueled a lot of that. So all of the packaging of mortgages into securities that got sold on Wall Street and fueling that money, and that just led for more appetite for more of those same loans, and led lenders to sort of systematically downgrade their standards for who they lent to, so that they no longer really cared, if you were telling them your right income or any other thing about you that was truthful. So the whole industry got skewed in a very bad way, and I think that we need to think, as we're looking at the aftermath, of putting it back together in a way that's more responsible and is really serving the interests of the community and not just short-term profit.
One of the things about affordable home ownership is that there are typically some safeguards built in that won't allow this to happen. George, you want to comment on that? I mean, you have a home buyer club. HPAP itself requires a certain amount of financial education. What's done in the District of Columbia that prevents this problem in the affordable arena?
Well, I think you mentioned it, Bob. If you use HPAP, and a large percentage of low-income buyers do, I happen to think it's probably the best or one of the best affordable housing programs in the country. Then they require education. They require homebuyer education. We operate the only nonprofit mortgage company in D.C., and we specialize in serving people with incomes under 80% of the AMI. That's not Michael Brown's AMI, that's the AMI. I think that, and we require that for our loans. I mean, we do that because we think it's the right thing to do. We think there should be more required education for people who get some type of subsidized loan or government loan to help them buy.
In other words, teaching them how to fish.
Right.
Is what was mentioned before. I thought that was a great analogy.
And Bob, I would echo that. I mean, Oxen Creek, a 210-unit townhome community near the Ashford Court product we built about 10 years ago, almost all of the all the buyers were first-time buyers, and most were below 80% AMI. And in this cycle, we did not see a rush for foreclosures. So the training that we gave them on the front end, the home buyer training, helped develop the community in a way to prepare itself for the downturn.
And I'll say right now, Bob, there's unfortunately the other extreme is the market forces are building in their own safeguards to the lending piece to it. I don't know if you were planning on touching on it, but I'm sure a lot of folks in the room recognize the lenders have gone, some would say, from one extreme to the other, from being maybe too loose with their lending standards 5-6 years ago to now overly meticulous, and it's particularly challenging in the low and moderate income because there might not be traditional sources of income. It's not a clean, I shouldn't say clean, it's not a traditional sort of checking account, W-2 sort of format. So unfortunately, a lot of the lenders are, even though the rates are what they are and they supposedly are lending out money, and I don't want to, we have a lot of good lender friends in this room, but that being said there are some, right now, the safeguard, the market is creating its own safeguard by being with its stringent lending standards across the board.
And particularly sensitive is the credit score. I mean, obviously the credit score is the driver of your interest rate and the underwriting of that loan. And having those higher credit score requirements really is punitive to the low, moderate income audience.
So the real question is, what do you advise low and moderate income home buyers? We just heard this statistic that, if I remember it correctly, 52% of assets, 52% of wealth for white homeowners comes from their home, 70% of African Americans. So it's critical that this continue if we want to build assets, but in this environment, there's a tremendous risk of job loss. Is it good advice to a low-income home buyer to purchase under the current circumstances?
Yes.
It is.
Unequivocally, yes. Yes.
Why?
Yes, I'll just say I think.
How do you deal with potential loss of job?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges. I think either Peter or George alluded to it, is sort of maybe getting back to some fundamentals, or Peter, you may have mentioned that, getting back to the fundamentals. I think there was some unrealistic expectations that were created over the course of the last couple of years, that all of a sudden you were going to go from being a renter a renter to a large house with a large yard, 0 to 60 very quickly. I mean, this is I think maybe in those fundamentals sort of a longer view, That longer view is it's going to take a little longer to do the savings. It's going to take a little longer to do the education. It's also, you're not going to get maybe the yard at your first purchase. Maybe the first purchase is, and I know, Bob, you talk about the continuum, the coalition talks about the continuum of housing. Maybe the first step is a shared equity place, and then a small, and then a smaller condo, and then you sort of work your way to that large yard. I think maybe that's one of the positive things that'll come out of the last couple of years.
I think that if you look at the reality, we're in one of the strongest economically metro areas in the country. So I think people have to take that into consideration. I think that now is the best time to buy. There's always a good time. Now is really great because of the low interest rates, which you talked about in your introduction, Bob. I mean, in many parts of the city, people can buy substantially. I mean, single-family detached house, a nice row house, for less than rent in that same area. And that doesn't happen very often. I don't recall it happening in the past 15
So,
20
George,
years.
just to stop you there, so if they're paying less than to be paying for rent, either way, you've got a risk. If you lose a job, you can't pay rent, you get evicted. If you lose a job, you can't pay the mortgage. That's a problem also.
That's what I was going to say. That's right. If you lose your job, you can't pay rent. And also, to become a homeowner in Washington, you don't have to come up with much money down. So, worst case scenario, you might lose a couple of $1,000s. It's not like, if you lose your job, you're not going to lose tens of thousands of dollars. And I'm talking about the low-income population that we serve.
Well, and I'll just say, just quickly, I'll just comment on, I recently came back from our National Realtors Convention, and the amount of low-income, sort of affordability, HPAP, I would be completely remiss about the D.C. $5,000 tax credit for a lot of folks, the federal tax credit, which unfortunately has expired as of 2009, but we're working hard with Eleanor Holmes Norton on. In addition to D.C. bond financing, a variety of programs, George's program. So it's one of those places where, with a little bit of due diligence, cobbling together, the amount of programs that you can cobble together are much greater than other areas.
I think the big challenge in all this is still the mortgage and the financing piece, because I agree with what George and Ed are saying. This is a great time, given the low prices, given the low interest rates, but people need to be able to get a mortgage.
That's right.
And so the requirements have become so strict. The conventional lenders have pretty much retreated and decided they're not going to be making these kinds of loans anymore, which means you only choice left for a lot of low-income families is FHA or places like Manna. So we need to, think about, I think on a national policy level, like what do we need to do to get the mainstream mortgage industry to better serve all the communities in the country, because we went from a situation where they were not making lots of loans to where they were giving lots of subprime products, and now we're back to where they're not lending anymore. So we need to figure out a way to solve that question.
Okay. Finally, the Comprehensive Housing Strategy Task Force back in 2006, task force in the District of Columbia, said that the district should increase its home ownership rate, which was in the low 40% range at that time, and as you know, compared to what's right now 67% nationwide, should increase that rate and emphasize particularly in areas like Ward 8, where at that time they reported a home ownership rate of 23%. Should the district continue to pursue that goal today, what policies should it adopt to encourage increased home ownership? And I noticed, by the way, on the report card that one of the big reasons we got such a low grade on home ownership was simply because of that rate of home ownership in the district versus what it is typically elsewhere. So what is your response to that? What can the district do to encourage more home ownership, if that is a good thing among low and moderate income people?
Well, I'd say, particularly for Ward 8, it's absolutely a good thing. It's a necessity. That low percentage of homeowners to that community is a real detriment. As far as Smith Company is concerned, we are very bullish on home ownership in the ward. That's why we're supporting 5 different projects and totaling over 400 units of housing for sale to low and moderate income families within the near term over the next 2 years. And we have another 400 units of pipeline project that we're contemplating and sort of working on in the drafting boards. So I think the district really does need to make a push, and it comes with funding for the credit counseling and getting people the training necessary, not just on the front end, but also post-settlement. I think HPAP needs to become, much more of a transparent vehicle, reporting on the pipeline of HPAP money that's gone out the door over the last 10 years, and what have the results been? Can they share some tracking information so that everybody can learn about the families that money has already gone to and helped? And I think obviously anything, whether it be the tax credit for purchasing or other direct funds like Housing Production Trust Fund, establishing those goals so that there's predictability. So from the developer side, there could be more confidence that producing the housing was a strategic initiative and smart to do.
Okay, George?
Yeah, right now there's a huge problem regarding appraisals, and that I don't think that problem has gotten out there. And what this means to developers such as William C. Smith and Manor, whether you're for-profit or non-profit, is that because of so many foreclosures and short sales in the area, the prices of other property are artificially depressed, way below one's cost. So I think, and this is really wishful thinking, but there needs to be some type of guarantee mechanism from the city to help build values back up and protect developers and sellers' property.
Ed?
If I may, those are perfect DC points, but I just don't want to bring it up just a couple thousand feet to the federal and macro level. I'm sure many in this room are familiar with the Debt Reduction Commission that came out last week, and one of the proposals was the mortgage interest, eliminating the mortgage interest deduction. That being said, we've starting to see sort of nationally there is a pushback. I mean, the downside of the last couple of years is there is a pushback of. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. There is a bit of a pushback that home ownership is a bad thing. I think there is. I think it's gone beyond a whisper campaign to something a little louder than that. And I think it's incumbent upon a lot of the folks who are in the home ownership field to push back on it. I think the mortgage interest deduction debate will come up. I don't know where it'll go, but that's part of it because I think what people forget, and I'm not. Please do not take this as everyone should be a homeowner before they are ready to be a homeowner. But at the end of the day, there are statistics. 31 for long-term wealth, a homeowner will average 30 to 45% more long-term wealth than a renter will. It's just is some of the statistics that I've heard is over the course of time. Again, don't push renters into home ownership before they're ready, but it still is one of the America's strengths in building long-term family wealth.
Great, thanks. We're going to throw open the floor to questions, comments. And before we do, though, I want to raise a couple of points that actually didn't come up in regard to this last matter. Home ownership, affordable home ownership, while we were talking about how great it is and how much we should support it, doesn't necessarily have universal support even within the affordable housing community. And one of the reasons, as you heard from Michael Brown, is that it usually is targeted at people in the somewhat higher end of the affordable range. Typically, I know Man has been able to do it in several instances, but most home sellers, even of affordable properties, don't go much below 50% of area median income. And so if you're going to focus the money at the lowest end, at the 27,000 people on the public housing waiting list, at the below 30% of AMI, or even adopt an AMI or a median income that's lower than that, you wouldn't be assisting people to become homeowners. So, how do we deal with that? Secondly, affordability covenants actually limit the amount of equity that an affordable home buyer can achieve from purchasing a home. In the district, we have very strict affordability limits. For instance, Housing Trust Fund, if you sell within 15 years, you must sell to someone else at the same income level, which means there will be some modest gain based on rising AMI, but certainly not the market gain if that's greater than AMI. And so that doesn't allow then for maximum equity building. And of course, there's very good arguments on all sides of this equation. But I just want to throw that out and see if there's anybody on the panel first that wants to give a short response to that, and then we'll take your questions and comments.
Well, I can just mention on that last issue, Bob. So recently, colleagues of mine at the Urban Institute, Ken Temkin and Brett Theodos, have published a report looking at 7 shared equity or restricted sales price programs around the country, including San Francisco, which is a high-price market like D.C. is, and found that those programs actually were very effective at maintaining affordability over a long time for home ownership opportunities for low-income families, at the same time allowing a good return on investment for the home buyers who bought those properties, even with the restrictions on sale prices afterwards. So when comparing, for example, if you took that same investment and put it in the stock market or put it in the bond market or did something else with it, in 6 out of the 7 programs, they found you got a much better return on this home purchase, even with the restrictions in place. So I think it can be done, and so that it's not necessarily going to limit the. But I
would submit that there's no free lunch, and if
there's no free lunch.
If you in fact sell something above the rate at which an equal income buyer could purchase, to that extent, that property is less affordable. But if you don't, if you keep it limited, then you're limiting the equity gain. And so, you can't simultaneously optimize both of these solutions. And that's a big debate we've been having here in the District of Columbia.
Bob, if I may, one other thing not to forget, I don't know if Councilmember Brown's still in the audience or not, and as he talked about the budget issues, we also have to be vigilant not to get caught into which sort of fighting within the home ownership spectrum, because it still is a very small part of the district's discretionary budget. If I'm correct, and correct me where I'm wrong, Bob, I believe 75 to 80% still goes to education, public safety, and social services. So when the affordable housing lines, unfortunately, are still a small sliver, and we have to. So when we look at it all, hopefully we don't get sucked into a debate while our other larger parts of the DC budget.
Right. Our continuing housing report shows that $1.33 out of every $100 goes to affordable housing out of the district's local appropriation. So you're absolutely right, George.
Yeah. One, I'd like to see how they computed the return, Peter, because how do you can leverage in housing more than you can leverage your investment dollars in the stock market or in mutual funds. I'm interested in seeing that. Number 2, regarding the ability to help very low income people become homeowners. 10, 12 years ago, our experience was, yes, you could help people who made 30% of the AMI in this area. What's that, in the mid-20s or so. That's not the case anymore. I've talked to practitioners all over the country, not just high metro areas like Washington, and it's extremely difficult. You may be able to qualify people that low, but really you're setting them up for failure because they're living on the margins, and you're doing them a disservice. Can you do it? Yes. Can you have occasional success? Yes. Have we had success? Yes. But I and others in my position around the country don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's really workable.
Great, thanks. Emily, you want to?
Yeah. I see a question over here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your work. My name's Anjan Roy. I had a question on, and I think some of you have touched on it, that can we actually have what's your thoughts on having independent education on not only when to buy, but the question of if one should be buying? For anyone who bought at the top of the markets or anywhere close to the top of the markets, particularly in those wards that were not 1, 3, and 6, I believe, or for that matter anywhere else, they didn't fare as well. And to what extent would you look at part of having your counseling, your financial education, and broader asset building education, looking at things on certainly not looking at this notion that housing always goes up, it's a great asset builder, and just using that as a as an assumption in your model, whether you're running a model on CDOs or running a model on whether you're helping somebody whether or not they should buy a home. But drawing out, having part of education being things like price to rent ratios, price to income ratios, and those are the ratios many people were using, the few that were calling the top back 5 years ago and doing it openly and loudly. And two, Mr. Rotman, you touched on this, with a lot of the studies that are done on how good of an investment housing is, many of them have subsidies built in or other, they're not apples to oranges comparison. You're talking about an incredible amount of leverage that a housing investor can use. 10 to 1 on a 10%, 20 to 1 on a 20%, on a 5%. So to what extent can we actually have independent asset education that can say, look, housing may not be the best option for you, that let's look at all the asset classes. Let's look at equities. Let's look at bonds. Let's look at there's probably there's other there's asset classes within subclasses within those classes.
Okay,
let's look at the 100-year time series, because you look at the 100-year time series, housing isn't that great all the time. So,
right.
And thank you.
Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Well, I'll just say, true confession. So I bought my house in Ward 5 in 2004. So I probably shouldn't be the one teaching that class about when you should buy. But I think that's just to say that I think a lot of smart people, were making guesses about what the market was going to do, and you don't always have the ability to see ahead in the future. So I think it's okay for me because I'm going to live in my house. And I think that's the advice we coming back to earlier, that's what we need to be communicating to people. Like, you should buy a house because you want to live in it and you're willing to live in it for 5 years or more, and then you will most likely be okay. But trying to guess what the best return is and how quickly you're going to make a buck, that's probably not a good idea.
But educating people so that they understand and appreciate that just because they can afford it doesn't mean they necessarily should. It has to meet a wider criteria. And it also speaks to a smaller amount of production housing or one-off real estate development, which, when they do a quick turn on a small rental building and they turn it into a condominium, you've got to understand what you're buying into, and you have to look at the long term. How good of a renovation was done to the property, and what about the capital reserves necessary to fund ongoing commitments? Those levels of study, aren't necessarily offered at the time that you're being sold the house. It takes a discerning, educated buyer to also have discipline, to practice some restraint, and to make sure that they have studied all the different angles of purchasing and come up with some decision that, yes, it's the right decision.
I would submit, too, that comments made by the keynote speaker are very relevant here. This should be done within a context, a life context. Where are you going, and what are your values? And I think even in the housing counseling, home purchase counseling arena, we might not be getting to some of that as much as we could. That would help people decide, is this really what I want? The degree of responsibility and so forth. Any other comment on that, or other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is, Councilman Brown raised two interesting observations. Thank you. Two interesting observations. One had to do with the gentrification trend, increasing trend of gentrification in the district. The second had to do, obviously, with the $500 million budget deficit looming. Both of those suggest to me that there's continual pressure to increase tax base or tax revenues through highest best value of use, which to me runs right in the face of what I'm hearing you discuss in terms of affordable housing, the increasing of affordable housing, especially the stock of affordable housing. The district's policy seems to be, and reflected in a number of ways, to move towards highest and best use in terms of as defined by increased tax revenues. And I'd just be interested to see how you address that schizophrenia between the two conflicting agendas.
Well, there are benefits for low-income buyers. I think there's a 5-year real estate tax exemption for low-income buyers. And then those who use the HPAP program, can get what's called a soft second loan for 5 years, and there are no principal payments due for 5 years, and no interest at all.
I would just say you're also scratching the surface of a hot topic I'm sure everyone in this room is aware of. Where do you put or where do you build affordable housing? Mixed use versus certain parts of town. I mean, that is an incredibly difficult challenge. And a week of this conference, I don't know, would easily solve that solution. But I think you're hitting at it, though. Highest and best use brings in more revenue, but then where do we put those units?
Yeah, the district has taken this into account in terms of low-income homebuyers in a number of different ways. You've got a senior, for instance, circuit breaker on property tax. You've got caps on how much property tax can go up. That actually applies to all of us, 10% max. And there are other provisions regarding low-income homebuyers. So the district has, while it is the intention, the district has explicitly made some exceptions for low-income homebuyers. Other questions? We got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Hi, I guess my question is a significant portion of the low-income residents here are undocumented, and I don't know if you had any options. I work with mostly undocumented residents on if there's a possibility for them to get a home or what options they might have in the home buying arena, since they probably will not have a credit score. Some of them don't have bank accounts, things of that nature.
One option is called limited equity co-ops. You do not have to qualify for an individual mortgage with a limited equity co-op. The whole co-op qualifies for a loan. And I do know that that is one vehicle where that could work. Anything else suggested here?
I mean, there are alternatives to credit scores that people are investigating. Unfortunately, I'm not so fluent on that topic, but I know that that's one issue. I also know in Chicago, I met with some folks at a bank that was doing ITIN-based lending, so you didn't need a Social Security number. If you had a taxpayer identification number, you could get a mortgage loan. I don't know. That was a few years ago, so I don't know if that's still something they're doing. But I think there are some alternatives that people have explored on that.
Okay, we got time for one more question.
So, at some sense, what we've been talking about is giving advice to homebuyers, and I wonder what you guys think. So this puts real estate professionals in the tough situation of wanting to give objective advice, but also having a stake in the decisions people make. So I wonder what you think about either holding real estate professionals accountable as fiduciaries or prohibiting them from giving financial advice.
I'm going to let Ed Krause answer that question.
I had a distinct feeling that was coming my way. No, at the end of the day, it's still the homeowner's responsibility. You'll actually see there has been a trend over the course of time. I think maybe, I don't know, the generation before, the realtor was everything. Or the agent was everything. Walked you through, helped you with the financing, that role is diminished somewhat and more specialized when it comes to lending. Talk to the lender. I mean, it has almost become they are staying more and more when it comes to the financing piece. Whether you agree or disagree with it, they're getting out more and more of my members push to the professional lenders and financiers, or in this space, sort of low and moderate income space, to George or LEDC. I know there were some LEDC folks in the room, or whoever the housing counseling providers are. I think actually what you're seeing is I don't know how you feel about it, but we more and more real estate professionals, if they don't know it, are getting further and further away from it for exactly the reason you said. They don't want the liability. They don't want their specialty is sort of the marketplace of the real estate stock and sort of helping people get through that. The lending and financing piece, not that I think it's safe to say most of our members stay away from that and direct them towards professionals.
Could we just, she's been trying to ask a question here for 10 minutes, so if...
Thank you. I was just going to ask George because it was for him, and I know him. I can ask him outside of here, but I'll try to make it quick. I was interested in the point you brought up just about the fear, and if you have a sense, in the low to moderate income market, is that fear really, is it driven primarily just by the, income? I don't know how much income I'm going to have. I could lose my job or I could reduce my hours, or is there also just this distrust of the housing market and of the professionals, and is that driving it? And the reason I ask is because it seems to me it's easy to, when you talk about the low-income buyer, to just have this picture in your mind that's a stereotype, single mom, 3 kids, whatever. I do this too when you work in the field, but there's a very broad, in D.C., diverse group of low-income people, and especially when it comes to buying, you brought up the point that you have more options when you own, even if you do have this risk of losing your income. You own it, you could take on renters. So are you sort of looking at different groups to even target where, especially in this market, there are some great opportunities? And if you're younger and you're not so worried about being there a long time, but you could rent out and hit hard times, it seems like a very practical, smart thing to do. So,
George, you want to comment on that?
No.
Well, you've made the case.
No, you gave
but
the answer.
I think regarding the fear, remember our experience is pretty limited. But our experience, before the recession, the fear was based on lack of knowledge and uncertainty. During the recession, now it's based on perhaps losing a job.
Right. Great.
But again, I think that's modifying now.
Thank you. Let's thank the panel for their great work.